Our subject this afternoon is partly Madame Blavatsky rediscovered and partly Madame Blavatsky and the powers latent in man. So, part one. Madame Blavatsky was one of the founders of the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875, and she died in London in 1891. Just north of here, in Avenue Road, St John's Wood. How do we get to know a person who lived many years ago? Well, there are photographs, such as the one on the wall, which you can now see. This is an image of HPB resting her head on her hand. And the photographer recalled what happened in a 1942 letter to John Coates, who later became the international president of the TS. He wrote, "One morning, the 8th of January 1889, I was in my studio at Cobalt Place, Bayswater, very busy taking photographs, when an assistant whispered to me that a lady wanted to be photographed. At once, if possible, having very little time to spare. So, after explaining this matter to the parents of the child who had the next appointment, to enable me to accommodate my unknown client, in came Madame Blavatsky, with the Countess Wachtmeister, who was her friend and colleague. The First Lady immediately sat down by a small table, and I noticed that she put her hand into her pocket and rolled a cigarette, which you will see in the photos. Or perhaps you won't see it in the photos, because I'm going to tell you something, but you must keep it to yourselves. Quite often, when this photo is reproduced, the cigarette is omitted nowadays. I told my assistant to get out some negatives, and without any studio arrangement, Madame Blavatsky expressed the wish to face the camera in that natural position, and being tremendously impressed with the personality and the expression, I took 6 plates, which to my delight were successful. Madame Blavatsky arose, thanked me for favouring her so quickly, saying some artist had recommended my work. The proofs were dispatched to be returned with a letter expressing pleasure at the results, and as you know, many thousands have been printed for the Theosophical Society, and that is quite true all over the world. In Theosophical Society offices you can buy postcards and other reproductions from those photographs. The photographer decided to keep the negatives, but some years later, when he gave up the studio, these were the only negatives which he decided to keep, and they were deeply treasured by him, he writes, and in perfect condition. But now that I'm an old man of 85, that's what he said in 1942, I feel that these realistic emblems of a great person should no longer be retained by me, and I'm honoured in being able to pass on my negatives to the Theosophical Society, their true anchorage. So he gave the negatives to us here at 50 Gloucester Place. We can also learn about Madame Blavatsky, HBB as we often call her by her initials, from her critics, such as the committee of the newly formed Society for Psychical Research, which, in an 1885 report, branded her an imposter. Now, I am an SPR member, and when I joined in 1967, it was generally accepted that Madame Blavatsky had faked the paranormal phenomena which occurred in the early days of the Theosophical Society. Especially the letters from Kuthumi and Moria. Those were pseudonyms of 2 members of an Oriental brotherhood who had inspired the Theosophical Society. But that opinion that it was all fake, changed after something that happened in this building, in this lecture hall, one Sunday evening around 1983. There was a senior member of the SPR called Dr. Vernon Harrison. Let's try going the other way. There he is. Dr. Harrison had been chief scientist at De La Rue, the banknote people, and he was an expert on forgery. And when he was asked to lecture here on a Sunday, he chose to re-examine the 1885 SPR report. Now, in the SPR, he would be called in for unexplained cases involving handwriting or photographs or music, because he was president of the Lit Society. He had a special qualification, by which I don't mean his long experience of fakes, but he had never been a theosophist. Indeed, he'd never knowingly ever met a theosophist, though he had read and admired Madame Blavatsky's writings. You see, there were plenty of people who had known HPB or studied her writings who did not accept what was called the Hodgson Report after its chief author, the 1885 exposure. But they tended to be theosophists and were generally disregarded. So, Dr. Harrison examined all the letters which are now in the British Library, sent by the supposed Koothoomi and Moyer. And there's one of those letters. He was also able to work at home on over 1,000 photographs of the letters in detail. I may say that that was possible through the help of the TS in Pasadena and also the Mahatma Letters Trust. And Dr. Harrison became quite indignant in an English sort of way. He found that there were three distinctive hands: Blavatsky, Koothoomi and Moyer. It was not a case of Blavatsky altering her handwriting to imitate the other two. She had not forged them. In April 1986, Dr. Harrison published his findings in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research under the title J'accuse, I accuse, a deliberate echo of a newspaper headline in the notorious Dreyfus case, in which a Jewish man in France was framed for espionage with the help of bogus handwriting evidence. That's the front page of that article, which appeared in the British Society for Psychical Research journal in April 1986. And to mark this article, the SPR issued a press release drafted in consultation with the Theosophical Society in England. This ended a painful split between the two bodies. Dr. Harrison concluded that the 1885 report was deeply flawed. Historians were thus set free to re-examine the case. Coincidentally, the first of a series of ongoing international conferences on theosophical history, to which the chair has already referred, was held here later in 1986. And the most recent was in September 2016. And the journal Theosophical History also began in 1985. Well, you may ask, what about the promised three-point plan to rediscover Madame Blavatsky? Point 1 is to read what she wrote. Point 2 is to see what the people who knew her best thought of her. And point 3 is to follow the latest research. Read what she wrote, see what the people who knew her best thought of her, follow the latest research. As an editor and librarian, I have often seen books about Madame Blavatsky and lots of articles in journals over the years. They may say, for example, that she was a plagiarist, that she copied things from other people, or that she invented her material. There's a bit of a contradiction there. And when I look in the bibliography of those books or articles, I may find that they've not included anything that she actually wrote. It's just something the author read about her. Academics in universities and so on seem vulnerable to this. No academic has ever suffered from writing inaccurately about Madame Blavatsky. She's one of those public punchbacks about whom a reviewer, for example, can be witty and derogatory without penalty. I especially remember a review of a biography of Madame Blavatsky the book was written by Jean Overton Fuller, a very experienced historian and biographer, and a member of this society. She thought a lot about Blavatsky. The book was reviewed in The Guardian, but not by a historian, but by an art critic. And it made the point that she was fat, as indeed she was in her later years. The implication was that therefore she need not be taken seriously, which is just as well as the reviewer did not engage with the detail of Miss Fuller's interpretation at all. Now, the Guardian newspaper is famously feminist, but Blavatsky did not qualify for serious treatment. Blavatsky and her teachers, it's still available, it's a most interesting biography. A book that was well reviewed in the serious papers was Madame Blavatsky's Baboon. Madame Blavatsky's Baboon, by Peter Washington, which made fun of Theosophists and their kind. It was written from secondary sources, not from archives, but from quoting other books. And George Harrison, the Beatle, was in the index because of his interest in a certain guru, but not Dr. Vernon Harrison, who I mentioned earlier, who'd done the groundbreaking analysis of the Mahatma letters, which had put to rest the accusation of forgery. Well, turning to Madame Blavatsky's own work, she wrote two massive books. Her first, Isis Unveiled, in 1877, deals in 2 volumes with science and theology, and argues that the testimony of secret knowledge, or occultism, shows there is much more to reality. It's not a book to start with. There it is, that's the first edition. It was put on plates, which meant that any errors or mistakes in it could not be corrected unless the whole thing was redone again. Her great work, The Secret Doctrine, in 1888, is partly a commentary on a poem, The Stanzas of Dizan, which deals with the history of the cosmos, the planet, and humanity. Many people get no further than stanza 1. That also is not a book to start with. There we are, that's the first edition, I think. But everyone can read with profit the extracts collected by Yanthi Hoskins in a booklet called Foundations of Esoteric Philosophy. Now this is this booklet, of which there is an online version. I do recommend Foundations of Esoteric Philosophy. This copy was given to me as a present in 1983 by my girlfriend after we attended a conference here. And I treasure it, you won't be surprised to hear. And to slightly misquote Charlotte Bronte, listener, I married her. I would recommend Madame Blavatsky's book, The Key to Theosophy, 1889, which is a clear and well-organised summary of what she taught in question and answer form. Now, you may recall that Mahatma Gandhi, the Indian nationalist, wrote that he had met 2 theosophists in London. See what he says there? I recall having read at the brother's insistence Madame Blavatsky's Key to Theosophy. This book stimulated in me the desire to read books on Hinduism and disabused me of the notion, fostered by the missionary, that Hinduism was rife with superstition. Now, those brothers were actually uncle and nephew, Archibald Keatley and Bertram Keatley, but they were of similar ages. Actually, the uncle was younger than the nephew. Think about that. But the Victorians had very large families. They didn't have any television. Blavatsky also wrote many articles, and collections of these are surprisingly interesting, such as the small volume Practical Occultism, which I'll come to later. Much, of course, is now online in Blavatsky Archives, for example. That's one of the pages from the website Blavatsky Archives. But there is a problem that the student should know. Not all editions of Madame Blavatsky's writings are facsimile editions. That is to say that they're not all exactly what she wrote. Most have been edited, the best ones according to clearly stated principles. Any publisher has to decide what to do about misprints in the original text or quotations and references that were not quite right. This may also affect books about her. In the Reminiscences of Countess Wachtmeister, the lady who was with her when she had her photograph taken, the Countess helped look after Madame Blavatsky when she was writing The Secret Doctrine. But there was a remark in the book about Jews by the Countess, which the American publisher Quest felt was not suitable for today. So you won't find that reference in the Quest edition. But the book itself, Reminiscences, especially in the original edition, is extremely valuable. I would also mention among actual biographies William Kingsland, the real H.P. Blavatsky, one of her students. After she died, some of her colleagues contributed to a volume in memory, and this gives a remarkable perspective on her multifaceted work. A special place is occupied by old diary leaves, published by Colonel Olcott, the first president of the Theosophical Society, and her colleague, especially the first volume of what were eventually 6. He attempted to understand her and offered half a dozen theories, but was left with many mysteries. Now, Olcott was trying to combat what he saw as over-enthusiasm about his colleague, who had died in 1891, with whom he was not always in agreement. And some theosophists considered him unfair at times to HPB. Well, now let's turn to the latest research. The development of computers and digitization, and the opening of some archives at least, has led to much more material being published about HPB than was available to previous generations. So, on points of detail, the picture is changing all the time. There are, however, 3 big developments. I've already mentioned the publication by the Society for Psychical Research in 1986 of a reassessment of their 1885 report, which had dismissed HPB as an imposter. Dr. Harrison showed that 3 different personalities wrote the main Mahatma letters. It was not HPB pretending to be the other 2, Kuthumi and Moya, KH and M. This means that we can reassess all the surviving Mahatma material, notably letters and memoranda. Some of it may be of dubious origin, but most is not. Now, Dr. Harrison's paper, which I showed you the first page of, was followed by a book, H.P. Blavatsky and the SPR, published by the Theosophical University Press in Pasadena. I do recommend this book. It is available in full text online. And I just want to show you something which I must confess I hadn't thought much about until recently. This is a typical page of a letter from Mahatma M, Moya, and it's written in red. And most of Moya's letters were written in red, and I don't know why. And if you do, I would be very interested to hear.
Very characteristic, I'd say.
The style of M and the style of Kuthumi are not quite the same. M is somewhat more brusque, and Kuthumi shows a sense of humour. I'm not going to tell you today the story of the goat which ate a letter from a very senior London theosophist. Moreover, to understand HPB, we must take account of comments about her by the masters, the Mahatmas themselves, such as this one. This state of hers is intimately connected with her occult training in Tibet, and due to her being sent out alone into the world to gradually prepare the way for others. After nearly a century of fruitless search, our chiefs had to avail themselves of the only opportunity to send out a European body. That's from the Mahatma letters. Well, the second important area of research is HPB's Buddhist roots. We can clearly see today that in some of her writings about Buddhism, she used such Western literature as was available. We owe a special debt of gratitude to David Regal and his wife Nancy. Now, for about 30 years, David Regal and his wife, he has a knowledge of both Sanskrit and Tibetan, have been exploring Buddhist literature for references that might point to the stanzas of Daizan and other sources of HPB's knowledge. And quite early on in his research, he was able to identify what she was referring to when she wrote of the books of Kai Te, which had puzzled some people, although the books had actually been mentioned under that name in European literature already. We can now see, much more than was the case 50 years ago, how deeply rooted HPB was in esoteric Buddhism. The third area, let me just add something here. Let's try that. Okay. The third area is Madame Blavatsky's contribution not just to the occult, but to wider culture, to what's been called popular occulture, to use the title of a new research project. Now, will I get where I'm going? No, I'll go to there for the moment. Her influence has been very great, not always acknowledged, and not always correctly interpreted. A recent biography of HPB by Gary Lachman has called her the mother of modern spirituality. If so, we need to study her carefully with the same care and respect we would give to any mother. So this is my 3-point plan. Point 1 is to read what she wrote. Point 2 is to see what the people who knew her best thought about her. And point 3 is to follow the latest research. You can keep up with some of it through the Facebook pages of the Theosophical Society in London and of the Friends of Theosophical Archive. So if you are on Facebook, make sure that you have a look regularly at Theosophical Society in London, where you'll also find out about some of the events here, and at the Friends of Theosophical Archives page. It's worth subscribing either to the paper edition or the electronic edition of the journal Theosophical History, which the chair mentioned. There's also a free online journal, Theosophy Forward, which reports on many international developments in several different languages, including English. And there's a group called Blavatsky Lodge, which meets here in this building. Pamela can tell you more about that. Madame Blavatsky herself used to attend its meetings when it met where she lived, which was latterly in Avenue Road, St John's Wood. Theosophists and inquirers have been meeting here at 50 Gloucester Place since 1934. They met here in 1940 for a European convention when barrage balloons floated overhead and the countries of some delegates were being overrun that very day and peace seemed distant. They met during the austerity years when you were invited to bring your own food and ration book if you came to a lecture here. In 1891, Gandhi attended theosophical meetings of Blavatsky Lodge, which, as you saw a few minutes ago, awoke him to his own Hindu heritage. Now that's details of associate members joining Blavatsky Lodge in 1891, and the second one down is Mr. Gandhi himself, who was living in Bayswater. And in this is a page from what we describe as Madame Blavatsky's visitor's book, although it continued after she died. It continued to be used at Avenue Road, which was Theosophical headquarters in London. And here we see the young Irish poets, George Russell and W.B. Yeats. They're about the third or fourth names down. And they're attending a meeting of the European Theosophical Society held at the TS in London in 1894. Now they're right next to each other, and I'd like you to think, do you reckon they came here by hansom cab, or do you reckon they came here by horse-drawn omnibus? My feeling is they hadn't got much money and they came by horse-drawn omnibus, but there we are. You don't have to be a member of the Theosophical Society to rediscover Madame Blavatsky, but there are aspects of her legacy that can be best understood from within the Theosophical Society, and so I would like to invite you to join. Now we're going to come in a moment to part 2, which is concerned with the powers latent in man, the third object of the TS which Pamela referred to. The early Theosophical Society was centred on powers latent in man. And indeed, we find such a view increasingly held by historians. For example, Professor James Santucci, the editor of the journal Theosophical History, expressed it in 1997. What the Theosophical Society was at its inception is not the society it has become. I've slowly come to this conclusion after years of investigating its origins and early years. A re-evaluation of the documents and articles and the uncovering of new material has strengthened my suspicion that the Theosophical Society was not an organisation that pursued only speculation or theoretical knowledge, but cultivated certain practices derived from this knowledge. The Theosophical Society was not an organisation that pursued only speculative or theoretical knowledge, but cultivated certain practices derived from this knowledge. In an 80-page report in 1987 by a New York lawyer, Pat Devaney, entitled Astral Projection or the Liberation of the Double and the Work of the Early Theosophical Society, Devaney pointed out that there was an undercurrent of practical, occult or magical work among the members of the TS in its New York days that has been largely ignored. One of the powers, therefore, which interested the early TS was astral projection. But from the beginning, there were differences of approach to these latent powers. Among the founding TS members was the medium, Emma Harding Britton. She postulated a new school of the prophets trained on mediumistic lines, and she engaged in a long struggle with Madame Blavatsky. Indeed, the two movements, modern Theosophy and modern spiritualism, remain in conflict today. Mrs. Britton issued in 1876 a curious volume entitled Art Magic. With this and with her novel Ghostland, Mrs. Britton claimed occult authority. However, Mark Demarest, an American scholar, through his research reported on his website, ehbritton.org, has traced back much of art magic to other 19th century writers, rather than to a supposed specific occultist, Chevalier Louis, whom Mrs. Britton might have known. Mark has also recently discovered a hitherto unknown newspaper report from 1875 about the early secret magical activities of the Theosophical founders. What were the philosophical roots of the search for latent powers in which the Theosophists engaged? Until Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Alcott left for India in late 1878, they were substantially Western, a point emphasised by the late Professor Nicholas Goodrich Clark. In 1878, Madame Blavatsky decided to remove from America to India, and after HPB and Colonel Alcott arrived there in 1879, there was an influx of new Oriental teachings. One group of teachings was triggered by some inquiries by an English Fellow of the Theosophical Society, F.W.H. Myers, whose certificate of fellowship survives with his first name wrongly spelled. Myers is the author of a classic in psychical research, Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. Much more Oriental teaching came through the Mahatma letters of which we spoke earlier, received by Mr. Hume and Mr. Sinnott. And when Madame Blavatsky had settled in England in 1887, there was a further expansion in her writings, especially the Secret Doctrine and the book Voice of the Silence, the latter with noticeable Mahayana Buddhist associations. By then, several other approaches to latent powers had emerged through other organisations. Myers had become the intellectual leader of the Society for Psychical Research. In fact, there he is, founded in London in 1882. And the SPR hoped to bring latent powers within the scope of scientific investigation. See how his first name is misspelled. I may say that during the years when the Society for Psychical Research was rather negative about Theosophy, they got to the stage of ever denying, in print, that Myers had been a member of the TS. And it wasn't until about 1985 that the original certificate of membership was found in his papers at Trinity College in Cambridge. We ought to note quite another line, the revival of ritual magic to release latent powers. A number of Theosophists became prominent in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, but Madame Blavatsky did not support this and set up her own esoteric school, which distinguish carefully between mere psychic powers and true spiritual development. If you read that little book I mentioned, Practical Occultism, you will understand this. There we are, Practical Occultism. It might seem that all was now set fair in the harmonious renewal of the search for the right kind of latent powers in the TS. But there was a new stream which would cause problems. Mr. Sinnott, one of the recipients of the original Mahatma letters, declined to take further instruction via Madame Blavatsky. And he turned first to hypnotic subjects who produced revelations when entranced, and later he began publishing revelations from mediums such as Robert King, sometimes in the name of London Lodge, an autonomous body within the TS. We can call this stream Neo-Theosophy, though the term itself is somewhere around 1913. Now that is Sinnott. There was one man who rejected both the Mahatma leadership and some at least of the Neo-Theosophy, and that was G.R.S. Mead, who had been private secretary to Madame Blavatsky until her death in 1891. Mead was inspired by the mystical exaltation of ancient Gnostics, Theurgists and Hermeticists. In the years after Madame Blavatsky's death, a new and long-lasting source of revelations emerged in the Theosophical Society. C.W. Leadbeater, a clairvoyant, enjoyed first the support of Sinnott and then before long that of Annie Besant, who after 1907 became the president of the Theosophical Society based in Adyar. Research of Mr. Leadbeater focused at various times on Christian origins, which interested Mead, past lives of prominent theosophists, which interested prominent theosophists, and the occult side of chemistry. On the fringes of the last effort was William Crookes, the greatest scientist ever to join the Theosophical Society, a fellow from 1883 to his death. In the mid-20th century, theosophical investigation of the powers latent in man reached its fullest extent. There are still people today who recall Lawrence Bendit, a psychiatrist, and Phoebe Daphne Payne, later Phoebe Bendit, a therapist who worked with children. Phoebe was also a clairvoyant. In 1938, she issued her classic work, Man's Latent Powers, a title which perhaps deliberately echoed the third object of this society. The book is still in print as Mankind's Latent Powers. And there came a joint book with Lawrence Bendit in 1943 called The Psychic Sense. Now there is Phoebe Bendit. We should not underestimate the extraordinary nature of Phoebe Payne's assertions in the context of the Theosophical Society. Phoebe was claiming a variety of psychic abilities, including contact, albeit unsought, with people who had died. Such communications on a strict interpretation of the Mahatma letters ought not to take place. This would be the case even if she was exercising what she termed positive psychism, in contrast to the widespread negative psychism she had found in spiritualism. There were, of course, other clairvoyants in the society. There was Geoffrey Hodson, and preeminently C.W. Leadbeater, who died in 1934. Unlike Phoebe, he was on personal terms with the Mahatmas and also had revelations about many weighty subjects, like the origin of Christianity and the inhabitants of Mars. These were treated as authoritative by many people, but such matters are conspicuous by their virtual absence in these early Phoebe books. Like Madame Blavatsky and Emma Harding Britton, Phoebe was also sensitive to non-human entities. Modern Theosophy has always paid attention to these. Psychical research, in general, has not. In fact, The Psychic Sense was the first British book on psychical research to use the term chakras, or psychic centres, as a conceptual tool. They were well known to Theosophical writers, but the term chakras did not appear in the SPR journal until Arthur Ellison mentioned them in 1962. Later, incidentally, he twice served as SPR president. Phoebe made another claim, which was elaborated in the jointly published book This World and That, in 1950, jointly authored, I should say. She professed to be able to attend seances and, unlike the mediums at those seances, to know really what was going on. Her awareness and vision was superior to theirs, she claimed. Indeed, she could on occasion cause the creation of spurious communications. This was a remarkable power indeed, and if true, it made Phoebe potentially of incalculable use in psychical research, although in fact little formal research appears to have been carried out with her by anyone. There was also the risk that the possessor of such insight might become puffed up, and it was just as well that Lawrence testified to her diffidence. It is apparent that both Phoebe and Lawrence from the 1930s did find a congenial network in England in the Theosophical Research Centre and its groups. The TRC was a unique manifestation in the theosophical world, without parallel in any other country. Such was the strength of the Theosophical Society here that it was able for several decades to attract and retain a number of scientists, doctors and similar professionals. And this is one of the later books to come from their collaboration, Psychism and the Unconscious Mind. The Bendits wrote and at first informally experimented with the centre, especially its medical research group, of which Lawrence was chairman for a time, and a book, Some Unrecognised Factors in Medicine, was one of the fruits. The Bendits were respected workers in psychical research between about 1939 and 1961. Lawrence on occasion reviewed books in the SPR journal. However, a crisis developed on the theosophical side. One account of it has been given by Arthur Ellison in his Blavatsky lecture. A new generation in the Theosophical Research Centre, whose science group was chaired by Dr. Ellison, was testing clairvoyance. They wanted to work with the best-known female clairvoyant in the TS, Phoebe Bendit. She declined. New theoretical work also led to the model used in the Bendits' book Man Incarnate being challenged, and there were wider problems, historical and scientific, identified in Arthur Ellison's lecture. After the passing of Phoebe and then Lawrence, the kind of third object work in which they were interested, a combination of healing, practical experimentation, metaphysical analysis and contemplation, became less common in the society. All that the Bendits wrote can still be read with profit. They would have followed eagerly, I believe, the many new streams of knowledge today which are often featured in the TS programme. I see that Robert Raval is coming back here quite soon to talk about the Great Pyramid, and I do urge you not to miss that lecture because I'm sure there will be some new information. While I would urge you to reread the Bendits, I should like eventually to leave you with this question. How should the Theosophical Society fulfill its third object in our generation? In Dr. Ellison's view, the cresting wave of theosophical research was to pass, to some extent at least, to the new scientific and medical network, because the TS in 1960 had been insufficiently open to new findings. Also, the Society for Scientific Exploration, based in the States, is another body where such research has a place. Dr. Ian Stevenson, a prominent SSE member and pioneer reincarnation researcher, had a partly theosophical background. In this area, perhaps the most useful thing the Theosophical Society could work towards contributing is a solid theoretical framework. In a broader or higher sense, however, we might ask just what is meant by the powers latent in man. I should like to leave Dr. Lawrence Bendit to answer that question, as he did in one of his late essays to be found in his anthology, The Mysteries Today. Man's greatest power is to become what he is. This way of seeing is much more useful than to think of the powers latent in man in terms of clairvoyance, magical ability, even healing power, or the setting loose of Kundalini. These are incidental, siddies, side issues, compared with the fact that man is the only, or at least the first creature on our own evolutionary ladder to be capable of self-transformation. The Bendits had lived through the emergence of depth psychology, Freud, Adler and Jung, and into the era of Abraham Maslow and self-actualization. The transpersonal psychology movement was just beginning. If they were with us today, They would, I suspect, welcome the latest developments in brain and consciousness studies and the move beyond materialistic models of mind, not forgetting the ancient wisdom, but adding to it, just as Madame Blavatsky engaged ceaselessly with the science of her day. Thank you very much indeed.
I'm sure you'll all join me in giving a great thanks to Leslie for this very interesting talk. Are there any questions? Yes?
I believe Madame Blavatsky was also accused of fabricating some clairvoyance or medium type seances. Is that, do you have any inside information on that, or whether that's any truth in that, or?
When Madame Blavatsky first went to America, not her first visit, when she went to America in 1873, she had been there before, she identified herself with the Spiritist movement. Now, she explained that she did this because she wanted to convey to the spiritualists, who were the main metaphysical group around at the time, the true interpretation of mediumship and allied phenomena. So for a year or two, she was often appearing in the Spiritist newspapers. And in 1877, however, when she published that first book, Isis Unveiled, she was extremely critical of mediumship, and she denied that most communications at seances came from those who had died. But there's no doubt at all about some similarity between some of her phenomena and some Spiritist phenomena. And she was on friendly terms with the English medium Stainton Moses. And some of the things that happened around him happened around her. For example, in some of his seances, fairy bells or astral bells would be heard from not too far away, but close by. And in Madame Blavatsky's case, for example, the sound of bells sometimes heralded a psychic phenomenon, such as the recipient of a letter paranormally. He also had experiences of paranormal sense. In his case, a very strange perfume would emerge from the top of his head, and not just in seances either, but in everyday life. And she also found that such sense would occur perhaps around her hands and so on. He also appears to have experienced astral projection to her accommodation in New York too. So there were certain similarities, and there was a long debate in her lifetime which has continued since. She argued that being a mediator in a spiritual sense was different from being a medium in a spiritist sense. And certainly what has happened over the years is the Theosophical Society has established itself as taking a different, perhaps a wider approach to mediumship and allied phenomena.
But in general, you think those phenomena were real, that when skeptics accused her of fabricating them, they were wrong?
I think in general they were real, but I think also that certain times some people did engage in doubtful practices. Now, I didn't quote an extract from a Mahatma letter, but I'll quote it now, referring to somebody called Damodar, who was a disciple, and quite an advanced disciple as well, and he eventually disappeared in the direction of Tibet. And it's generally held by Theosophists that he was the only Shaler at that time who didn't get irrevocably lost. But K.H. once wrote of Damodar, who'd been the manager of the Theosophist Journal, "The poor boy has had his fall. Before he could stand in the presence of the masters, he had to undergo the severest trials that a neophyte ever passed through, to atone for the many questionable doings in which he had overzealously taken part, bringing disgrace upon the sacred science and its adepts." Now, some of those events may well have taken place at the time of the Society for Psychical Research investigation. People do become over-enthusiastic sometimes. They make claims over-enthusiastically as to how they did this or how something happened. And they help phenomena along, and this happens, of course, very often in psychic circles and so on. But there is a great deal of testimony to spontaneous events around Madame Blavatsky that cannot be explained. I do recommend the first volume of Old Diary Leaves by Colonel Alcott, which is based on his original diary, which he wrote at the time. And you can see him puzzling over these very strange events that happen around HPB.
Thank you. I think we have one here next.
Talking about the
research in the middle of the 20th century by people associated with the Theosophical Society and Psychical Research.
Yeah.
Did their results, well, their interpretations, were they the same as other researchers within spiritualism, for example, or the contemporary researchers? Was their output more or less the same, or did they have a completely different interpretation of what was going on?
One of the problems which arose with people like Arthur Ellison and one or two other of the scientists such as Dr. Lester Smith within the Theosophical Society was that they were much more sympathetic to the conventional spiritualist interpretation, the cautious spiritualist interpretation of the phenomena. And this was a point of tension. In Dr. Ellison's case, his first wife had died quite suddenly, he was bereaved. He investigated personally the psychic field, and that's how he came up with conclusions that differed from what he generally accepted up until that time as someone who'd been a theosophist from childhood, as it were. I wouldn't say that the theosophical interpretation of phenomena has been generally accepted by psychical researchers. But I would note this. Psychical research, or parapsychology as it's often called abroad, has struggled to gain acceptance and has struggled to make progress. Although there's been a fair amount of theoretical speculation, it's struggled to find a framework to interpret the phenomena. Now, my own view is that there's a great deal that can be learnt by psychical researchers from what we might call the theosophical framework. And that view would be echoed by Vernon Harrison, who was a very experienced SPR member. I knew him personally, and came to regard Madame Blavatsky's ideas as very useful in interpreting psychic phenomena.
Thank you. Am I involved in anyone else?
Yeah. How did Madame Blavatsky get in contact with the masters? Did she look for the master, or the master came, and why is she the one picked by the masters?
Well, to take the last point first, she seems to have had a very unusual constitution, physical constitution, spiritual constitution, and psychic constitution, which enabled them, after training, to use her. She was born and brought up partly in an area of what we may broadly call Russia, which was open to Buddhist influences. She came into contact when still quite young with Buddhists, particularly tribes in the area who were Mahayana Buddhists. And later, when she began her world travels and so forth, she was well placed to be contacted by people who wished to make use of her latent abilities and to train her. So in the extract from Mahatma letter I quoted, it is stated that she was the only person that they had found who was suitable to work with. Now, how did she receive these communications? The answer is in a variety of ways. There's a very valuable Blavatsky lecture on that very subject by Geoffrey Barborka. Sometimes she received them in writing. Sometimes she received them clairaudiently. Sometimes, indeed, they were dictated to her. Carl Alcott writes of how he would see quite clearly sometimes that she was taking down things from dictation. And sometimes she was entranced. William Judge, the early American theosophist, recalled occasions when the teachers who worked with her would entrance her in New York and deliver messages. But she always maintained that the people who entranced her were living people and not people who had died. Incidentally, this term Mahatmas, apparently this was coined by Damodar, the disciple. It means, of course, great soul. But originally, she just referred to the people for whom she worked as the brothers. And I rather prefer the term, my mother's term, the brothers, to the term Mahatmas, but it's become generally accepted now, and I suppose we have to stick with it.
Yes, there was one at the back here.
Oh, hi, thank you. Can I ask first two questions, if you don't mind? When you were talking about Phoebe Bendit, you said that she talked about, you made a distinction of what's called positive and negative spiritualism, or the spiritualism of the spiritualists, as it were, was described as negative. I wasn't quite sure what that distinction
She writes a positive and negative psychism. Her idea is that negative psychism basically involves going into trance and being used by other entities. And she is arguing that there's a better thing which she calls positive psychism, which involves not going into trance, probably undertaking some kind of spiritual discipline in which you remain conscious and become more conscious, and not being controlled by outside entities. Now, it's a tricky path that she was following because within the Theosophical Society, understandably, there was quite a lot of wariness of the entire psychic dimension. But she more or less sustained it. But what I've suggested perhaps is that firstly there wasn't very much actual experimentation done with her except of an informal nature. She did help in various psychic problem cases, especially involving children. And secondly, the framework that she was using, as Arthur Ellison came to feel, was not perhaps a correct framework anymore in the light of subsequent developments in science, particularly physics and chemistry. So she's a very important pioneer. She was born in poor circumstances in the East End of London, and she made contact with psychic organisations in the early 1920s. She worked for some time at a body called the British College of Psychic Science, which doesn't exist anymore. And I think it was a great help to her that she made contact with the Theosophical Society. Edward Gardner, E.L. Gardner, leading Theosophist, was a mentor to her. And also, of course, that she met Lawrence Bendit, who was a Theosophist and a doctor, and that they were able to work together for many years.
If I may, my other question is about the Regals.
Yeah.
I've only just come across them myself. I was wondering to what extent the Regals are working within mainstream Tibetology, as it were. I mean, how mainstream is their research?
I don't think their basic conclusions are accepted. Obviously, most Tibetologists are not in any way Theosophists, although a number have been. Evans Wentz would be an example, and Dr. Konze would be another example. But they have to accept, of course, that the Regals know Tibetan and that they know Sanskrit. And so there's been, I would say, a qualified acceptance of some of the points that have been made, that this or that teaching put forward by HBB was not known in the West at the time when she did, but has subsequently become known, partly because of the vast explosion in availability and translation of Tibetan material following the Chinese occupation of Tibet. Now, I brought this out in more detail in an earlier paper, and the Regals have a website on which you'll find a lot of their papers. One of their basic points is that a number of aspects of Tibetan Buddhism were not known in the West until, say, the 1950s or 1960s, but Madame Blavatsky anticipates them in various ways. So their contribution has been very important.
Yeah, I read that the masters withdrew from the TS. Why did they do that?
Well, that's a very considerable point of dispute among Theosophists and also among scholars, for that matter. Madame Blavatsky died in 1891, and some people took the view, and this crops up with other esoteric groups as well, that when the teacher dies, that's it. And perhaps indeed the inspirers of the teacher no longer work with them. After Madame Blavatsky died, the leading figures in the Theosophical Society were William Judge in the United States and Annie Besant, who at that time was still in London. And then about 4 years later, they fell out, quite spectacularly, as sometimes happens in organisations, a bit like one or two political parties I could mention, but I'm not going to. So what happens then? One group of Theosophists claims that the other group of Theosophists is not in touch with the masters. And there's a fierce dispute about this, which rumbles on to this day. As I say, some Theosophists, there's a lady called Alice Leighton Cleather, who'd been a pupil of HBB, after some years contemplating the situation, concluded that the masters had withdrawn. Now, as I say, this is an issue where Theosophists do not agree. A very strong case can be made that the masters did continue to work with Theosophists in various ways. In the meantime, we have a very rich legacy left by Madame Blavatsky, which we are still exploring and we are still studying, and also the legacy by the other early workers such as Mabel Collins, who transmitted light on the path and so on, and especially also the Mahatma letters, which were not published until about 1922. But as to the extent to which the masters continue to work with the Theosophical Society is very much a point of historical inquiry. And here I would especially mention Krishnamurti, who was brought up to be the vehicle of a world teacher who it came to be felt by some Theosophists was going to emerge in the very near future. When Krishnamurti reached manhood, full manhood, in 1929, he declined to take on this role, although he continued to be a teacher. And he also is part of the rich tapestry of Theosophical history. And I would recommend you to further explore and consider these questions.
Are there any more questions?
Just one. I was here for a little bit of the history conference a little while ago, but I didn't quite hear all the words spoken by somebody who put some of the Mahatma letters through a computer and analysed them.
Yes.
Could you sum up possibly what conclusions were reached by that research? What the author has done, Bojko Zlatev, who's family is Bulgarian and lives in Canada. His parents were active in the Bulgarian Theosophical Society before the Second World War. He did a pilot study of some Mahatmic letters material and analysed various verbal constructions and so on. Now, it suggested that there were different personalities involved in the material, but nothing conclusive. It was just a pilot study. Right.
He brought with him some Bulgarian theosophical literature, some of it pre-war, some of it post-war, and it was good to be reminded of the worldwide stretch of the Theosophy and the tremendous impact that Madame Blavatsky has had all over the world, really, in so many societies.
One more, if it's possible. If, let's say, majority of us come from a Christian background, how do you see this communication with other spirits in a Christian view? Or how one can decide that communicating with the good spirits or bad spirits, or even appearance of a good spirit, that we might say it's a good spirit, but we do not know.
Madame Blavatsky maintained that the people she was working with were living men. They might be quite well-trained and gifted living men. Adepts was the term that was often used, but they were living men. Now, there's no doubt at all that the Mahatmas were critical of Orthodox religion, not just Orthodox Christianity, but Orthodox Hinduism, for example. They were generally critical of organised religion, and this is very much a theme of the early teachings, and there's no avoiding this. There's a definite conflict between what we might call Orthodox Christianity and the mainstream teachings of the early Theosophists. Later on, indeed from the beginning, there were always attempts to reinterpret the Christian faith in what was called esoteric Christianity. A lady active at the time of Madame Blavatsky, for example, was Anna Kingsford, who became, for a time, well, she was the first president of the London Lodge. She was president of the British Theosophical Society that became London Lodge. So there is a strong tradition of esoteric Christianity which has expressed itself in various ways and which interprets the Christian faith from an inner way. Now, how acceptable that is, either to Christians or Theosophists, has been a controversial point. I once gave a lecture to Blavatsky Lodge, Esoteric Christianity Reconsidered, and I can put you in touch with it if you want to know more.
Thank you. Now that the collapse of the Soviet Union, what freedom of worship is existing in Russia, could you say anything about how her, whether she's now taken seriously in modern Russia and the Theosophical Society? Do you know anything about that? How it is now treated?
Well, there has been Theosophical Society activity, shall we say there has been Theosophical activity in Russia, particularly in Moscow, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Problems arise sometimes with theosophical groups in various countries because they sometimes promulgate other teachings which are not quite what the Theosophical Society as a whole would approve of. There's an extra complication here in that Madame Blavatsky was more connected in some ways with the Ukraine. And you know very well, of course, the very serious situation in the Ukraine in recent years. And in fact, there are groups active in the Ukraine who are trying to preserve what remains of Madame Blavatsky's legacy there because of the change in national boundaries and so on. It's certainly true that it's possible now for Theosophy and also for related movements to be active in Russia, although the climate is becoming more hostile. The Russian Orthodox Church is very powerful, and I'm not sure what the future holds there.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, wasn't Anna Kingsford a scientist?
She was a doctor. She was one of the first women to qualify as a doctor, but she had to train in Paris. As a woman, she was not allowed at that time into a medical school in this country. Annie Besant, who was the second president of the Theosophical Society, international president, was not allowed to take certain scientific degrees in London because she was a woman. And one of the things that's very striking about the early Theosophical Society is, firstly, it admitted women as members fully. Secondly, it admitted members of different races. This was a time of intense racism, particularly like places like India, but people of all races. We just find them sharing, not just in the membership, but in the activities and the leadership of the Theosophical Society. It's a pioneering interracial body. And Anna Kingsford becomes president of the Theosophical Society in England, the British Theosophical Society in 1883, at a time when women don't have the vote. And women play a prominent part in theosophical leadership. Annie Besant becomes the first international president who is a woman in 1907. This is very early, and it reminds us that these people were radicals, and they caused a lot of controversy by the radical nature of their social and religious teaching.
Is that it? Are we done with questions? Well, if you'll all join me in giving thanks to